This is Fauxthentic History.
Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Brian Young.
And, Brian, you've probably heard of Charles Dexter Ward.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a young man whose descent into madness was written about and documented at length by his doctor, Marinus Bicknell Willett. And that account has been studied for years, both by those fascinated with psychology as well as those interested in the occult.
Which is why I'm really excited that today we're going to talk about a man connected to Ward through family, Joseph Curwen. What makes this particular piece of history so unique is the fact that all evidence of Curwen ever having existed appears to have been systematically destroyed or hidden for a long time until his young descendant Ward discovered clues about the man who was called an enigmatic and obscurely horrible individual.
Yeah, that's not really a descriptor you want attached to your name.
No, not at all.
So Joseph Curwen was born just a few miles from Salem, Massachusetts on February 18th, although the year of his birth is a little unclear, either 1662 or 1663. And the location of his birth was in a place that was actually called Salem Village at the time, and that correlates to modern-day Danvers, Massachusetts. And this sandy-haired young man ran away from home at the age of 15 to pursue a life at sea. For a long time, it was a mystery what he had been up to during those years. But he returned to Massachusetts a little less than a decade later, and then he made a home for himself in Salem.
But the Joseph who returned to the Salem area was different than the young man who'd left, in ways that transcended the natural growth and maturity one would expect. He'd adopted the behavior of an English gentleman. Additionally, he had no interest in his family and chose to distance himself from the people he'd known as a youth.
Instead of reestablishing his place in his family and the community, Curwen opted instead to study a variety of books he had brought back with him from his travels to Europe. He was very solitary for a while. He also imported various mysterious chemicals, which arrived on ships from Holland and England and France, though it was unknown what exactly he wanted these chemicals for. And it was also rumored among Salem's residents that Curwen had been spotted setting fires on hills outside of town in the dead of night.
He also took up socially with two men, Edward Hutchinson and Simon Orne. Orne was a resident of Salem proper. Hutchinson was from Salem Village and lived in a house outside of town, which was the focus of many suspicions and rumors. Strange noises often came from the home, strange, inconsistent lights shone in the windows, and strange visitors came and went.
When the witch panic happened in the Salem area in 1692, Hutchinson and Curwen both left the area. This was undoubtedly due to the fact that their names actually appeared in witchcraft trial records. On July 2nd of 1692, a man named Hepzibah Lawson testified that he had seen 40 witches meeting with, quote, the Black Man in the woods behind Hutchinson's house. And Lawson described one specific night during which he clearly saw Simon Orne and Joseph Curwen, as well as 6 other people, receive the devil's mark on their person at such a gathering.
Hutchinson wasn't to appear anywhere on record again after that. He disappeared. His property, in his absence, was found to contain a library filled with odd tomes, including an unfinished manuscript he himself had written, which was written in code. Curwen's descendant, Charles Dexter Ward, attempted to study and interpret the text, and while he never told anyone if he'd broken Hutchinson's code, he began to exhibit extremely odd behavior about a year into that project.
Orne, unlike his two friends, stayed in Salem through the panic, and he actually lived there until about 1720. But by that time, he had begun to unsettle people. He simply wasn't aging. And as concern about his odd state of stasis grew in the community, Orne finally decided to leave Salem.
In 1750, a young man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Orne appeared in Salem to claim Simon Orne's property. The young man who claimed to be Jedediah Orne had documentation that were determined to have been written by Simon Orne himself, so his claim was honored. Jedediah lived in Salem for more than 20 years, but then correspondence from Providence caused something of a stir, and Jedediah was soon no longer a Salem resident. We'll loop back to this in a bit.
Yeah, because we want to get back to Joseph Curwen. So while Hutchinson seemed to have vanished, and Orne left and was soon replaced in society by his, quote, son, Curwen had simply moved to Providence. He qualified there as a freeman. That was a term used in colonial-era America to denote a person without legal restraint. So he qualified as a freeman, and with that legal hurdle cleared, he purchased a property on Stamper's Hill, which later became Olney Court, and he built a house there.
Many years later, in 1761, Curwen built a new, larger home to replace the previous one. This means he would have been about a century old, but based on descriptions, he looked to be in his mid-30s and seemed to only age about 5 years for every 50 that passed. He claimed that this was basically just the result of good genetics and healthy living.
And if you're wondering why on earth Curwen didn't raise suspicion among the townspeople of Providence for this odd situation regarding his age, he did! But he was also very, very wealthy, which, let's face it, buys some tolerance. He came from a well-known and a good New England family, and he was a successful businessman, having monopolized the import of saltpeter, cinnamon, and black pepper. And during this time that he was living there and people were kind of raising their eyebrows but putting up with him, he also had a farm, like a separate property in Pawtuxet.
So the farm drew a not insignificant amount of suspicion for a number of reasons. For one thing, it had way more livestock than was normal. For another, bizarre shipments were constantly being delivered to the farm. There was far more food delivered to the farm than the known occupants could ever eat. And on top of that, there was a stone tower on the property that the nearest neighbors often heard cries and screaming emanating from.
Yeah, like his livestock turned over at a really high rate, but it wasn't like he was selling, slaughtered cows at market or anything. It was just him and 2 known servants, a married couple, and they had way more food coming in all the time than 3 people could ever possibly manage to consume. Very weird stuff. And Curwen, of course, did not receive many visitors to the Pawtuxet farm property, but there were a couple. One in particular, a man named John Merritt, gained the favor of Curwen by mentioning that the mysterious man had a reputation for having a really impressive library, and that he would love to see this collection.
Curwen invited Merritt to see just how extensive his collection was, and for some reason seemed comfortable letting him see a number of tomes that raised suspicion immediately. One of these was a book that was labeled Kanun-i-Islam, but Merritt realized almost immediately after opening it that what he was holding was a copy of the terrible and forbidden Necronomicon, a book of spells and death.
And another volume that Merritt found in Curwen's library was a copy of a book titled Borellus. And in it, Merritt found one passage that was heavily underlined, which he found unsettling. That passage read, quote, "The essential salts of animals may be so prepared and preserved that an ingenious man may have the whole Ark of Noah in his own study, and raise the fine shape of an animal out of its ashes at his pleasure. And by the like method, from the essential salts of humane dust, a philosopher may, without any criminal necromancy, call up the shape of any dead ancestor from the dust whereinto his body has been incinerated. In short, you can raise a person or creature from their remains or their dust, a truly unnatural endeavor if ever there was one."
Merritt would later say that he found nothing at the farm itself alarming, but that those books were enough to inspire loathing of the place.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, that's not... that would be... just the knowledge of it would start to really work on you. I'm getting a little anxious just talking about it.
It's super creepy. And during this same period, there was growing discomfort among the sailors, clerks, and captains that were part of Curwen's business dealings. They all seemed really uneased by him, and the turnover in their personnel was quite high. Additionally, sailors visiting Providence seemed to disappear, which further caused suspicion to swirl around the oddly youthful Curwen.
One particular incident in March and April of 1758, just a few years before Curwen replaced his home with a larger one, a large number of soldiers from 2 regiments quartered in Providence disappeared, completely. Because Curwen had been seen speaking to many of the men who later vanished, it was just one more mark against him.
And those marks that were accumulating despite the man's business success had really been adding up. And they started to catch up to him in terms of his standing in the community. There was only so long they could overlook all this weird stuff because he was successful and wealthy. So he started to make a concerted effort to fix his public image by engaging in positive civic work. For example, he replaced and rebuilt damaged structures for the town, he replaced library books that had been lost in a fire, and he became a prominent member of a local church, at least for a little while.
But even though these gestures helped somewhat to soothe the community, there was still distrust of Joseph Curwen. It seemed he continued to focus on improving his standing with his neighbors as sailors stopped disappearing. Strange noises at his farm seemed to have subsided, and people stopped spotting him lurking in cemeteries. He did seem to import a great many slaves, and people didn't know where they went or what happened to them, though.
And so, while he was making some small progress to abate the suspicion that seemed to constantly follow him, it wasn't really enough. So he decided to get married, because he thought that being seen as a family man would surely cast a positive light on him. But he also knew that if he tried to woo a young woman, it would look really, really weird and possibly creepy. So he opted to arrange a marriage for himself.
After assessing his options, Curwen set his sights on a young woman named Eliza Tillinghast, who was 18 years old. Her father was captain of one of Curwen's ships, and Curwen took advantage of his standing to basically pressure the man into giving him his daughter. Curwen had a history of blackmailing his subordinates into staying in his service with knowledge of personal dealings that no man should have been able to know, but somehow he always came into possession of such secrets. It's very likely that this sort of coercion is what prompted Duty Tillinghast to promise his daughter to the odd man.
There was one little problem, which was that Eliza was already engaged at this time to a young man named Ezra Whedon, so she was not exactly pleased to discover that she had been promised to Curwen. But nonetheless, the marriage did take place on March 7th of 1763. And Eliza, as a bride, lived exclusively at the house in Providence. She never visited the Pawtuxet farm. The marriage and Curwen's gracious treatment of his young bride did indeed help his image. He was deemed to be, during the early years of their matrimony, quote, more like a normal citizen than at any other time in his long years of residence.
2 years and 2 months after the wedding, the couple had a daughter named Anne on May 7, 1765. As was the case with all other evidence of Curwen's life, the birth of this child was at some point stricken from the historical record and was unearthed only after diligent searching and correspondence on the part of Charles Ward.
And not long after Anne's birth, which Curwen had been really quite excited about, Joseph decided to have his portrait painted by the famed Scottish artist Cosmo Alexander. And this painting was actually done not on a canvas, but directly on one of the wall panels at the Olney Court home. And he continued to participate in community activities and using his fortune to do good works.
However, since the marriage, Curwen was quietly being watched by Eliza's former lover, Ezra Whedon. The young man saw through Curwen's carefully constructed veil of normalcy and viewed the man with great suspicion. He watched both Curwen's shipping business at the docks and routinely watched the farm at Pawtuxet.
I have to say, reading about all of Ezra's watching of him, I wonder if that poor kid ever slept. A year after Anne was born, there was a sudden and very noticeable change in Curwen's behavior. He suddenly seemed almost giddy. He was constantly excited when people saw him. And Curwen started spending more and more time at the farm and delegating a lot of his importing business to the captains that ran the ships for his company.
Ezra watched Curwen's ships and noticed that they no longer carried slaves to the drop point at Pawtuxet to then be taken by land to the farm, but something was being delivered by night in that same manner from the docks in Providence to Curwen's property. It appeared that these strange items were coffins. Note, this was several years after the marriage, so Ezra Whedon was incredibly dedicated to his vengeance against Curwen for taking Eliza away.
Yeah, not only did he devote a lot of time, like in any given day, to watching this man, but he did it for a long time. He really did not trust him. And Ezra also enlisted the help of his friend Eleazar Smith to cover his surveilling of Curwen when Ezra was at sea, because he was, as many people in Providence, part of the maritime businesses. The two men agreed to keep any of the things that they saw and heard to themselves for the time being. They didn't have any interest in tipping their hand to Curwen that he was being watched. They wanted to gather as much evidence against him as possible. All that they learned, though, has only been pieced together from some pretty sporadic writings in Eleazar Smith's diary, which, as I said, it was not thorough. Ezra Whedon kept journals during all of this, but at some point he burned all of them.
After Ezra and Eleazar watched things at the Pawtuxet property for a while, they became convinced that there were catacombs under the farm. At times, they overheard conversations, some of them coming from under the ground, in English, French, and Spanish. Most of it was talk of historical events or science, and this was a significant development. Prior to 1766, the noises heard from the farm tended to be mumbling, screams, or occasional chanting, but after that, there was a shift to clear, complete conversation, though much of it seemed like questioning that sometimes included pained noises as though torture were involved.
Yeah, it didn't entirely stop the mumbling screams or chanting, but in addition to them, very clear conversations started to come through. And in one such conversation, some being of some type, was being questioned about an event that happened in 1370. The Black Prince's Massacre at Limoges. And in this exchange, Curwen asked the other entity specifically about what might have precipitated the killing, and mentioned specifically the sign of the goat and a dark man of the Haute-Vienne coven. And then there was a shriek, and then silence, and then some muttering and a bumping noise.
On a subsequent visit to eavesdrop, Whedon got too close, and the husband and wife who worked for Curwen set their dogs upon him. He overheard no other conversations after that.
In early spring of 1769, there were really heavy rains in the area, and the onslaught of water resulted in some human and animal bones being unearthed in the area around his farm. And while the possibility existed that these were from a Native American burial ground, Whedon and Smith believed otherwise.
In January of 1770, custom agents inspected a ship bound for Providence from Cairo, Egypt, and found that it carried exclusively Egyptian mummies as its cargo. The captain refused to name the recipient of these goods. The boat was not allowed to dock in Rhode Island, and it was rumored to have made port in Boston sometime later.
People immediately made the connection to Curwen in their suspicions as to the intended destination of that mummy cargo. And in this really socially awkward bit of attempting to normalize the situation, it appeared, Curwen, without admitting that the mummies were his shipment, that they were destined for his farm, casually mentioned around town a few times that mummies were really helpful. They contained chemical compounds that are beneficial in completely benign and beneficial ways.
Yeah, that didn't raise any flags at all.
That was so weird. I don't know if he was hoping that people would be like, oh yeah, mummies aren't that weird, I guess. Oh, those are yours? Okay, that's fine.
In spring of 1770, there was another rash of heavy rain, which caused part of the riverbank at the farm to collapse, revealing a cavern that was caved in. There were also grisly reports from downstream of entirely unnatural things being seen in the river. Locals reported a creature which appeared to look at people as it passed down the river, and another which cried out as though still alive, even though it was severely decayed.
Yeah, that cave-in, Eleazar saw it, and he made a small effort to dig in and see if, there was an entryway into what they thought the catacombs, into where they thought the catacombs would be, but he didn't dig very far. And just the thought of, if you were to see a dead body of some type floating down the river, and then it appeared to be looking at you, that would be super creepy. But then to see the same thing happen, and the next one is screaming, I would move far away, personally.
Yeah, I would get out of there forthwith.
So, later in 1770, in the autumn, Ezra and Eleazar finally decided to notify someone as to the things that they had been hearing and seeing at Curwen's farm. And so they decided to confide in Captain James Mathewson. And the captain heard them out, and he had his own suspicions about Curwen's dark dealings. So he decided to gather a group of men to investigate. And these men were scholars, reverends, politically important people, all really, really smart, level-headed, well-educated, and scientifically and philosophically minded.
The men assembled a raiding party to confront Curwen, and they were all ready to confine or kill him if what they found on his farm warranted such measures. But an unsettling event unfolded as they planned their raid.
Yeah, one snowy January night, a, quote, shocking series of cries was heard. And many in the area were awakened, and they saw some sort of large white creature making its way across the landscape, running. Many men, everybody was awakened, so people went out to investigate that night, but they found nothing. But the next morning, a massive, muscular, naked body was found on an ice float that was by the docks, and the prints in the snow indicated that it had come from Curwen's farm.
No one knew what it was, but it looked like a man who'd been dead for 50 years. Blacksmith Daniel Green, whose great-grandson Aaron Hoppin was working for Curwen. An exhumation of Green's coffin revealed it to be empty.
Yeah, that group of men that were assembling the raiding party kind of did that little bit of exhumation on the down low, and were not entirely surprised, but certainly were horrified to realize that Daniel Green was not buried where he was supposed to be. And that party of Mathewson's men also started intercepting mail to Curwen. So the first letter that they saw was from Jedediah Orne. In it, he wrote, quote, "I say unto you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down, by the which I mean any that can in turn call up somewhat against you, whereby your powerfulest devices may not be of use."
Orne also detailed his exit from Salem and the need to spend 30 years away before reappearing as a representative of a new generation. Jedediah Orne was the same man as Simon Orne.
In a letter that was later found by Ward, which appeared to have been written by Curwen to Orne once that man had resettled as Jedediah, Joseph mentioned that he simply could not have made the same move to leave Providence that Orne did in leaving Salem, in part because he needed to stay near the port to receive his, quote, uncommon things, and also because of something under his farm in Pawtuxet that he couldn't leave.
Curwen also relayed to his friends some seemingly unearthly projects he'd been working on, and the difficulties he'd been having with some of them. Some of the problems seemed to stem from not being able to get enough specimens, a word which became more ghoulish when the next line mentioned using sailors from the Indies.
And Curwen in this letter conveys the idea that he feels the townspeople are growing suspicious of him, and he feared that some of them may have been speaking more seriously about his work than the sort of idle gossip that always surrounded his name. And he also included some incantations in the letter, as well as some unnamed substance that he mentions being in the packet, and he instructed Orne to use both, especially if Orne desired to see, quote, him in all capital letters.
Curwen finished the letter with the line, "Sir, I am your old and true friend and servant in Almasin Metraton." Almasin was the name of a demon that would later be mentioned in the work of a French occultist. Later analysts would survive that the use of the word Metraton was actually a misspelling of Metatron, which was a name apocryphally attributed to Enoch, an ancestor of Noah, after he transformed into an angel.
Yeah, there's also a reference in that letter to Job 14:14, which reads, quote, "If a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait, till my change come."
A second letter to Curwen, intercepted by the men monitoring his mail, this one from Philadelphia and with no signature, discussed issues with using imperfect or incomplete remains to call up creatures.
A third intercepted letter was in indecipherable script, and when linguistics experts were consulted about it, they determined that it was an Amharic or Abyssinian alphabet. The letters were not assembled into words that they could recognize.
It was not long after these letters were read by Mathewson's group that Jedediah Orne vanished from Salem. It's believed that the men who'd been in the know in this scheme, quote, took certain steps that resulted in Orne never again appearing in any public record. It was also during this time that the plan to erase Joseph Curwen from all historical entries was underway.
And for his part, Curwen did have a sense that something was afoot. He became increasingly suspicious that people were out to get him, and he became less and less willing to keep up public niceties. And one evening, as reported by his neighbors, a family called the Fenners, a beam of light shot out of that tower at the farm.
On April 12, 1771, 100 men, entrusted by the initial group Mathewson assembled, gathered at 10 p.m. in a Providence tavern. At 10:30, Curwen's coach passed over the Great Bridge, and the raiding party followed shortly thereafter. It took them about an hour and 15 minutes to get to the Fenner farmhouse adjacent to Curwen's farm.
And from there, those men split into 3 groups. First, a group of 20, led by Eleazar Smith, headed to the river shore to guard against any possible reinforcements Curwen might send for. Because as he started acting weirder and weirder, they wondered if he wasn't preparing for them to come. A second group of 20 that was led by a Captain Hopkins made their way down behind the house at the farm to an oaken door in a hillside that they believed was probably an entry to Curwen's catacombs. The remaining men set upon the main house and the adjacent buildings.
There was a 3-whistle signal system in place. A single whistle would signal the men at the catacombs door to break that entrance open to wait and see what might emerge. 2 whistles would signal those men to enter through that door, in effect trapping any within as the larger group entered through the main house. A 3-whistle signal would alert the men guarding the shore to come in the event of an emergency, and that group would split into 2 and approach from both the hillside door and the main house.
And once all were ready, which was just before 1 a.m., the men went to their positions. Eleazar Smith would later write that he heard 1 whistle and then a muffled mix of, quote, roaring and crying and a powder blast which seemed to come from the same direction.
There may also have been gunshots and what seemed like thunderous words in the air. A messenger arrived in the pre-dawn, smelling strangely, and told the men to return to their homes and never speak or think of that night or of Curwen.
Yeah, so those guys that had been waiting at the river shore basically stayed there the whole time just hearing things and not really knowing what had happened. One of the neighboring fenners briefly mentioned that night in some correspondence, which was later unearthed. And that account reported barking dogs, the whistles that were made by the raiding party, although their count of the number of whistles is different than Eleazar's account, muskets being fired, and a strange and terrible cry, which made the lady of the Fenner household faint just to hear it.
The Fenner correspondence continued the description to mention additional blasts, screams, indeterminate rumbling that caused their candlesticks to shake, more barking from the dogs, and 2 flaming objects of indeterminate origin. After the farm had fallen silent, a red fog was seen in the sky by one of the Fenners, followed by a cold wind and a terrible smell that no one could identify. Then the Fenner family heard a loud, bellowing incantation in the air, and then a more human wailing from the farm, and finally a yell of madness.
The Fenner family was visited by 2 men, presumably from the raiding party, just before dawn, who told them that things with Joseph Curwen were concluded, and they also asked to buy a keg of rum. They additionally warned the Fenners to never mention the events of the previous night. And the correspondence in which all of this is recounted also included instructions to the recipient to destroy these letters, but that recipient apparently did not do so.
8 men died in the raid at Curwen Farm. For many of the men who'd been there, the events leading up to the Revolutionary War in the following years eclipsed the events at the Curwen Farm and enabled them to move on to other things.
1 week after the raid, a burnt body was rumored to have been found in the fields nearby. But there wasn't really any documentation, and that body, according to gossip, was neither human nor animal.
The body of Joseph Curwen was given to his widow in a sealed lead coffin, which had been found on the property. She wasn't informed about the raid, but was instead told that her husband had died in an unsavory customs battle.
Yeah, and Elizabeth eventually changed her last name back to Tillinghast. Same with her daughter, and that's part of that erasure from the record that happens.
So as we mentioned at the top of the episode, Ward went mad while studying Curwen in the 1920s, but that's oversimplifying.
Yeah, Ward used directions included for Orne in that piece of correspondence that we mentioned earlier to track down Curwen's house, and he found the portrait that was on the wall there after he got approval from the home's current residents to do so, to go in and look. And he loved the painting, which resembled him a lot. They were basically identical, so much so that Charles's father arranged to have that panel cut out so that Charles could have it.
When they did this, a cubby was revealed behind the wall panel that held Curwen's journal, papers to He Who Comes After, with instructions on unholy affairs, letters to Hutchinson and Orne or their heirs, and an account of Curwen's travels when he was sailing around the world. Charles Ward studied these and other texts diligently, becoming withdrawn and isolating himself during his studies.
So, during this period, most historians agree that Charles began to descend into madness. At one point, he wrote a very intense letter to his doctor, Willett, claiming that he had conjured up something terrible and desperately needed the doctor's help. Willett visited Charles later that day and found him quite unlike himself. He didn't seem to know anything about the world around him, or his family, or anything.
Charles was so strange and acted so oddly that he was taken to an asylum. He was only able to whisper, and his body tissues were aged beyond his years. He was also missing a known birthmark, but had a new black mark on his chest, and knew a lot about the past, but as we said, nothing of his contemporary world.
There are some historians over the years that have suggested a certain likelihood that Joseph Curwen was able to communicate with the dead, and even conjure living things from the dead. There are certainly a great many things that make this seem like an almost plausible possibility.
Additionally, it's believed by some that through his study of Curwen's letters and texts on necromancy, Ward managed to conjure his ancestor and was killed and replaced by him, a possibility supported by the fact that the two men looked almost identical. And there were certainly investigators at the time of Ward's hospitalization that came to the conclusion that such things were happening in the world.
Willett and Charles Ward's father investigated further, and Dr. Willett seemed convinced that a conjured Curwen had in fact murdered Charles. Willett's writings indicate that he himself found and burned Charles Dexter Ward's body to spare the family of that horror.
Ward, or perhaps truly Curwen, was confronted by Willett. Dr. Willett claimed to have confronted the entity and used his magic against him to defeat him, but on the official record, Ward vanished from his hospital room and was never recovered.
Yeah, it's a fascinating possibility, right? That this person who was so long-lived, I mean, on record as having lived way longer than normal, may have in fact somehow, through these little clues that he left behind, particularly behind the painting, managed to take possession to some degree of his relative, and through that possession manipulate things in such a way that he could once again be brought back from the dead and then continue his life.
It's terrifying to think about.
It is. It's one of those things that you don't want to think could possibly be true, because it is so terrifying. But then there are a lot of odd things that are not easily explained away in the story of Joseph Curwen.
I think that's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
So we don't have any mail this week. But did you have anything else you wanted to add, Holly?
Nope. Just creepy good fun.
And where can people find you?
I am on Twitter as @SurliestGirl, and people can find us at Fauxthentics. That's FAUXTHENTICS, I think.
And if you would like to find me online, you can find me at Swankmatron, and you can find Holly and I together on the Full of Sith podcast as well.
Indeed.
And if you would like to leave us an email, you can do so by going to fauxthentichistory.com, hitting the contact form, and sending us an email. It all comes straight to us, and we'd love to hear from you about this or any other episode. So unless there's anything else, until next time.